Does the Old Testament Bible promote and command slavery? We'll explore what the Bible teaches on this and review key scholarly research about this topic. Some recommended scholarly references include two books by Dr. Paul Copen and the presentation by Dr. Peter Williams. I put these linked books, articles, and videos in the description below for further reference. A good place to start on this topic are the teachings of Jesus and his view of the Old Testament. Jesus would have been very familiar and well versed in the Old Testament teachings. Especially relevant are the Mosaic laws contained within the first 5 books, or Torah, Pentateuch, in our Bibles. Jesus often quoted or referenced these books. Jesus clearly is recorded as teaching that he didn't come to abolish the Old Testament laws, but came to personally fulfill them. In Matthew 5:17 and 18, Jesus is recorded as teaching us that, "Do not think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've come not to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass away from the law until all is accomplished." Fortunately, however, many of the leaders of Jesus' time had added to, changed, or miscommunicated the laws and commandments of the Old Testament. Jesus often challenged and corrected this. For example, Jesus again clearly referenced one of these Old Testament instructions when responding to a question about divorce. Some of his hearers referred back to the known teachings of Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 1. In Matthew 19:7-8, we read how Jesus responded to them. They said to him, "Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away?" He said to them, "Because of the hardness of your hearts, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so." This gives us an amazingly insightful Jesus window through which we can use to read back and understand some of the Old Testament instructions and how and why they were originally given. Jesus said that Moses allowed this particular certificate of divorce, Deuteronomy 24 and 1, because of the hardness of their hearts. But this accommodation rule was not as it was intended as part of God's original creation ideal in Genesis. By carefully using Jesus' Old Testament window with some similar accommodation passages, explains that some of these Old Testament laws were not intended to be timeless ideal, but given for Israel at a particular time in history to accommodate a non-ideal situation brought on because of their hardness of heart. Dr. Paul Copen refers to these laws as accommodation laws. Copen and other scholars argue that servitude is included in this. Copen goes on to remind us that, in much the same way as Jesus' window into the Old Testament shows that many of these laws do not reflect God's moral ideal. Though the Mosaic law was not intrinsically immoral, this wasn't the perfect law for God's people for all times. This law expressed God's tolerance for and God's accommodation of certain inferior moral conditions, such as servitude. They offer concessions to human failure. They are what God tolerates, not what he delights in. Certain laws permitted non-ideal behaviour, but this was due to the Israelites' hardness of heart, as Jesus taught. There are 2 different types of commandments in the Old Testament law given to the ancient nation of Israel for that time. The first are absolute commands, which are introduced: do this, don't do this. Examples are in the 10 Commandments. For example, do not steal. The second are case laws, when an example is given. If this happens, then do this. For example, in Deuteronomy 24:7 we read, "If a man is found stealing one of his brothers of the people of Israel, and if he treats him as a slave or sells him, then that thief shall die. so you shall purge the evil from your midst. Notice the if-then type of structure of this case law. There are many more, often related to servitude cases and treatment of servants or workers. It was the role of the priests and the elders to apply the principles of the law to particular cases brought before them. Hence, care must be taken when reading the Old Testament so that we aren't confusing the two types of law. The accommodation and case laws were therefore not perfect or universal for all, or for all time. So what about the actual Hebrew word used for slavery, sometimes used in some Old Testament translations? The word used is ebed. Copeland clarifies here that the word ebed isn't inherently always negative, but can be positive, neutral, or negative depending on the context. The term does not assume adjectives like degrading, oppressive, or owned. In fact, the Hebrew neutral term can mean worker or servant. Notably, there are a range of uses for the word servant. Non-Israelites, who are lifelong servants, who can become rich in Israel. See Leviticus 24:47. Temporary servants for debt repayment, or those who serve God. Copeland goes on to define the basic meaning of ebed as one who is in a dynamic dependency relationship. Baker, cited in Paul, goes on to say that the Hebrew word translated literally means worker. This is what I will refer to it as in the video in each appropriate context. So why are people servants in ancient Israelite society? In the Old Testament, there was no national economic social security or support. It was a subsistence economy. Servitude in Israel was generally the result of poverty, not because the law of Moses institutionalized it. So debt, servitude. How did the New World and Roman slave trades compare to ancient Israel's servitude? The wealth of the poor and needy in Israel was a priority. The Old Testament law sought to prevent voluntary debt servitude. For example, the poor were given legal rights to glean the edges of fields and pick lingering fruit after harvest. Leviticus 19:9, 23:22 and Deuteronomy 24:20-21 talk about this further. Failing this and other support laws, Copeland adds that the poor Israelite would follow 3 steps. Step 1 was initially to mortgage one's land. In Leviticus 25:25a we read, "If your brother becomes poor and sells part of his property." Step 2. If this fails, one would seek an interest-free loan. In Leviticus 25:35-38 we read, "If your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain himself with you, you shall support him as though he was a stranger and a sojourner, and he shall live with you. Take no interest from him or profit, but fear your God, that your brother may live beside you. You shall not lend him your money at interest, nor give him your food for profit. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, to give you the land of Canaan, and to be your God." Step 3. If steps 1 and 2 fail, then the financially indebted would then contract themselves out, an indentured servant, to work for a fellow Israelite. They are treated as a contracted employee, who can eventually return to normal life once the debt problem is resolved. Copeland illustrates this by stating that during difficult economic times and the poverty that results, Israelites and aliens or immigrants would have to enter the service of another to work and sustain themselves and possibly their families. Additionally, sometimes ravages of famine and war and the migrations these may have created would have been devastating for individuals. Israelite households, through agreed contract servitude, potentially provided security, food, clothing, and shelter for these foreigners. So the main reason for servitude was economic and debt. it was not race-based. Debt servitude in the Old Testament was voluntary. Unlike forced slavery, there was no third-party seller involved, just an agreement between two parties. Ancient Israelite servitude was not like the more recent transatlantic 16th to 19th century slave trade. For example, it was not race-based and was voluntary, and, as we shall find out later, kidnappers were given the death penalty. Dr. Peter Williams adds that, unlike the Israelite servitude system, Roman slavery and the later transatlantic slavery permitted and often encouraged kidnapping, change, torture, physical abuse, all of which were not permitted in the ancient Israelite servitude arrangements. Both Roman and transatlantic slavery weren't required to provide enough food, legal redress, or sexual protection. Again, as we shall find out later in this video, ancient Israelite laws legally mandated all of this. So how were servants legally required to be treated in ancient Israel? And did they have any legal rights? We will explore this important aspect in further detail in part 2 of this two-part series.